I wish you weren't my wife." Nathaniel said it right there at the table, candlelight flickering, champagne untouched, and then he set his phone face down like the words he'd just dropped meant nothing. Clara's hands went still in her lap. 5 years. She had worn the blue dress he once loved just to sit across from a man who was already gone. If you've ever loved someone who stopped choosing you, stay with me until the very end and drop your city in the comments so I can see exactly how far this story travels. The reservation had been Clara's idea. She had called the restaurant 3 weeks ahead, specifically requested the corner table near the window, the same table where Nathaniel had ordered sparkling water instead of wine on their first real date, because he said he wanted to remember every detail of her face clearly. She had told the hostess it was their 5th anniversary. The hostess had said, "How romantic." Clara had agreed. She had believed it. She spent 40 minutes on her hair that evening. Not because she was vain, but because she remembered the specific way Nathaniel used to look at her when she wore it loose around her shoulders, like she was something he couldn't believe was real. She found the blue dress in the back of the closet, the one with the small pearl buttons at the wrist that he had once said made her look like a painting. She ironed it herself. She was careful with it. She was careful with everything that night. She told herself the distance between them was temporary, that marriages went through seasons, that the man who'd stopped reaching for her hand across the bed, who'd started taking his dinner calls in the back office and returning to the table without explaining who he'd been talking to, who'd looked through her more than at her for nearly a year, that man was still somewhere inside the person she'd married. She just needed one good evening, one real conversation, one moment where they both remembered what they had built. She drove herself to the restaurant because Nathaniel said he'd come straight from a site walkthrough. He was already seated when she arrived. He didn't stand. He used to stand. Clara noticed that immediately, the way you notice a missing step in a staircase, your body registers it before your mind does. She smoothed her dress and smiled anyway, because she had decided that tonight she would not count the small things. Tonight was not about keeping score. "You look nice," he said. Not beautiful. Not the way he used to say it, leaning slightly forward like even across a table he wanted to be closer to her. Just nice. The word you used for a coworker's new haircut. "Thank you." She sat. She put her clutch on the table beside her. "I'm so glad we're doing this." Nathaniel picked up the menu. They ordered. She had the salmon. He had the steak, the same thing he always ordered, and she found a brief warmth in that predictability, something familiar in a year that had felt largely unrecognizable. The bread came. She buttered a piece. He checked his phone and set it face down beside his water glass. That was the first sign. Not the phone itself. Men in business kept their phones close. She understood that. It was the way he placed it. Deliberate. The screen pressing down against the tablecloth, the way you turn a photograph to the wall when you don't want to be reminded of something. "How did the Hargrove project go?" she asked. "Fine. Did they finalize the offer on the West Side property? It's moving forward." "That's great." She took a sip of water. "You've been working so hard on that one. You must be relieved." He made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite dismissal. A sound that belonged to no conversation, that meant nothing, that slid off the evening like water off glass. Clara set down her fork. She had promised herself she wouldn't push, but she had also promised herself she wouldn't perform, that she wouldn't spend their anniversary narrating pleasantries into a void and calling it connection. She had driven here in a dress she'd ironed with her own hands. She had called 3 weeks ahead for this table. She was owed at least the dignity of a real conversation. "Nathaniel." She waited until he looked at her. "Are you okay? Are we okay?" He looked at her, the way you look at something you've been expecting to deal with and have been actively avoiding. Not with surprise, with resignation. "Clara." "Because I feel like we've been strangers for almost a year," she said, keeping her voice low, even controlled. "And I know you've been busy. I know the business has been demanding, but I miss you. I miss us. And I need to know if we're working on this together, or if I've been working on it alone." The candle between them wavered. Nathaniel put down his fork, and then he said it. "I wish you weren't my wife." The restaurant kept moving. Somewhere behind her, a couple was laughing. A server was asking someone about dessert. The kitchen was producing sounds of ordinary life, the clink of pots, the low rhythm of a busy Friday night. All of it continued exactly as it had been. Clara did not move. She wasn't sure in that first second whether she had heard him correctly. The mind does that, offers you a mercy delay, a half second where you can still reinterpret, still reshape what was said into something survivable. She waited for the reinterpretation. It didn't come. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice came from somewhere separate from her body. "What did you just say to me?" Nathaniel didn't look away. That was the part that undid her most, that he didn't flinch, didn't immediately backpedal, didn't reach across the table and say he hadn't meant it. He sat with it. He let it land. "I said I wish you weren't my wife," he exhaled. "I'm not trying to be cruel, Clara. I'm trying to be honest with you. Finally." "Finally," she repeated. "We've been unhappy for a long time." "You have been unhappy," she said. "I have been trying." "That's not the same as being happy together." "Nathaniel, it's our anniversary." She heard how she sounded, bewildered, like a person trying to locate north and finding the compass broken. You couldn't wait until after." "I've been waiting for a year," he said. "Every time I tried to say something, we got busy, or the timing was wrong, or you were going through something, and I kept pushing it down. I kept thinking I'd feel different, but I don't." Clara looked at the man across from her, the man who had once driven 40 minutes in a January snowstorm to bring her soup when she had the flu. The man who had held her hand in the hospital waiting room when her mother had her surgery, who hadn't let go for 4 hours. The man she had rearranged her life around quietly without resentment, because she had believed he was the person she was meant to build something with. "You don't feel what," she said. "Finish the sentence." I was quiet for a moment. "In love with you," he said. "The way I should." The bread on her plate had gone cold. She noticed that. She noticed the strangest things. "Is there someone else?" she asked. The pause before he answered was its own answer. "Nathaniel." Her voice had gone somewhere very still. "Is there someone else?" His phone lit up. I didn't pick it up, but they both saw it. Clara's eyes moved to the screen before she could stop herself, and she caught a single word before he flipped it face down again. Victoria. The name sat between them like a stone dropped into still water. "How long?" Clara said. It wasn't a question. It was the beginning of an inventory. "Clara, it's not, how long has there been a Victoria?" He rubbed the back of his neck. He did that when he was cornered. She had watched him do it in negotiations, when a deal wasn't going his way, when he needed a moment to calculate. She knew every one of his tells. She had spent 5 years learning them. 8 months, he said. 8 months. Clara did the math without meaning to. 8 months ago was January. In January, they had taken a long weekend trip to Savannah, something she had planned to try to bridge the distance she'd been feeling. She had thought it had helped. They had walked the waterfront. He had bought her a book from a street vendor. They had slept with the window open and listened to rain. 8 months ago, he had already been with someone else. Every memory she had reached for as evidence that she wasn't imagining things, that there was still something real between them. Every one of those memories was now reframed, contaminated. The weekend in Savannah, the Sunday mornings where he'd made coffee and sat beside her on the porch, quiet and apparently content. The birthday dinner 2 months ago, where he'd kissed her temple and told her she never aged. All of it had been what? Performance habit, a man keeping his accounting in order while he built a separate column somewhere else. "I want to go home," she said. "Clara, we should talk. We just talked." She picked up her clutch. Her hands were perfectly steady. She didn't understand how, but they were. "You said what you needed to say. I heard you. Please don't leave like this." She looked at him. "Like what?" she said quietly. "With my dignity, with my head up, because that's exactly how I'm leaving, Nathaniel. That's the only way I know how." She stood. She put her napkin on the table. She walked across that restaurant, past the laughing couple, past the server asking about dessert, past the hostess who had called their reservation romantic, and she pushed through the front door into the cool Charleston air, and she kept walking until she reached her car. She sat in the driver's seat for a long moment. She did not cry. She wasn't sure why. The tears were there. She could feel them pressure behind her eyes like a storm that hadn't broken yet. But something else was happening inside her that was louder than grief. Something that she didn't have a name for yet. Something that felt like the specific silence that comes after a very loud sound, the moment when your body is still ringing, but the noise itself has stopped. She drove to her sister's house. Madeline Brooks was 10 years older than Clara, divorced herself after a marriage that had lasted 12 years and ended when she discovered her ex-husband had an entirely separate credit card he used for another woman. Madeline had survived that. Madeline had rebuilt. Madeline was the person Clara trusted with the truth of things, because Madeline did not soften reality into something more comfortable. She told you what she saw. Clara knocked on the door at 9:47 at night. Madeline answered in her robe, took one look at her sister's face, and stepped back without a word. Clara came inside. She sat down at the kitchen table, and then the tears came. They came in waves, the ugly kind, the kind that have nothing to do with looking composed or being graceful, the kind that are just grief happening to a body that can't contain it. Madeline sat across from her and didn't try to stop them. She put a glass of water on the table and waited. When Clara could speak again, she talked for almost 2 hours. Everything she'd noticed over the past year, the distance, the phone calls in the back office, the way he looked at her, sometimes like she was an obligation he was trying to figure out how to discharge. The weekend in Savannah that she now understood had been theater. The birthday kiss on the temple. 8 months of lies wearing the costume of a marriage. Madeline listened to all of it. Then she said, "What do you want to do?" Clara looked up. "What do you mean?" "I mean exactly what I said. What do you want to do? Not what do you think you should do, not what's the right thing, not what anyone would expect from you. What do you want?" Clara thought about it. "I want my life back," she said finally. "The one I had before I made it about him." Madeline nodded slowly. "Then let's figure out how you take it back." They talked until 2 in the morning. Madeline had a friend, a good friend. She said someone she trusted completely, who was a family attorney in Charleston. His name was Daniel Prescott. He was known in the specific way that capable people are known within the circles of people who've needed them, as someone who was methodical and thorough and did not flinch from complexity. Madeline thought Clara should call him first thing Monday morning. Clara agreed. She stayed at Madeline's that night. Madeline gave her the guest room and a clean set of towels and a spare toothbrush, and did not hover, did not check on her, gave her the gift of privacy and silence. Clara lay in the dark for a long time looking at the ceiling. She thought about the word Victoria, the single syllable of it, how it had lit up Nathaniel's phone at the worst possible moment, or maybe not the worst, maybe the most clarifying. Maybe that name appearing exactly when it did was the one thing that had prevented her from believing any part of what came next could be repaired. No room left for doubt. No space for her to talk herself into a more charitable interpretation. She thought about what he had said, that they'd been unhappy for a long time, that he meant it as honesty. She turned that over carefully, the way you turn something in your hands to look for the flaw, and she found that she did not disagree with the unhappiness. What she disagreed with was the word finally, as if his decision to stop pretending was a gift he was giving her, as if she should be grateful that he'd chosen now here over cold salmon and a reserved table to tell her that he'd been building a different life. She was not grateful, but she was surprisingly something close to clear. In the morning, Madeline made eggs and coffee and asked Clara no questions. They sat on the back porch and watched the light change and drank their coffee in the kind of quiet that only exists between people who have known each other long enough to share silence comfortably. "I'm not going to fight for him," Clara said finally. Madeline looked at her. "He said he wished I wasn't his wife," Clara continued. "I'm going to make that wish come true." Madeline was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That might be the most controlled thing I have ever heard you say." "I feel controlled," Clara said. "I feel like I'm in the eye of something, like I could feel everything right now if I let myself, and I'm choosing not to yet, because if I feel everything right now, I won't be able to do the things I need to do." The things being, calling Daniel Prescott, finding every financial document in that house, understanding exactly what our assets look like before he gets a chance to restructure them. Madeline set down her coffee cup. "You know," she said, "in 12 years of marriage, I never once pulled the bank statements myself. I left everything in his hands because I trusted him and because I didn't want to seem suspicious. When everything came apart, I had no idea what we even had." She paused. "Don't make my mistake." "I won't," Clara said. She went back to the house on Sunday afternoon, while she knew Nathaniel would be at the Hargrove project site. She moved quickly and methodically through his office, not searching wildly, not ransacking anything, but going through the files she knew existed, the folders she'd watched him build over years of their marriage. Tax returns, bank statements, property investment records, the portfolio documents for the company she'd watched him grow from a two-man operation into something that employed 34 people and owned 9 properties across the state. She made copies, all of it. She also found something she hadn't been looking for, a credit card statement tucked behind the investment files for an account she had never known existed. The charges on it told a story that was very simple to read: hotel stays in Atlanta and Charlotte, a jewelry store in Savannah, a restaurant whose name she recognized because Nathaniel had told her 8 months ago that it was a work dinner with a developer from Georgia. She stood in his office with that statement in her hand. She felt the something that had been building in her chest since Friday night take a clearer shape. It wasn't rage, though rage was part of it. It wasn't grief, though grief was woven through everything. It was something that felt more like the specific anger of a person who has been made to feel small by someone who was never actually larger than them. The anger of understanding, finally, that she had believed a lie, not because she was foolish, but because she had trusted someone who had proven decisively that he was not worth trusting. She left the house. She called Daniel Prescott from the driveway and left a message for Monday morning. She drove back to Madeline's with the folder on the passenger seat, and she thought about photography. It had been years since she'd thought about it without the accompanying weight of everything she'd given up. She'd started her career right out of college weddings at first, then corporate portraits, then a brief, intoxicating stretch of editorial work for a regional magazine that had seen her photos and reached out to ask if she'd be willing to work with them. She had been willing. She had loved it with the specific love that you feel when you're doing the thing you were built to do. Then Nathaniel's company began its expansion. The Charleston office needed to grow. He needed someone who could manage the administrative side while he chased the development deals. It happened gradually, the way these things often do. First, she'd helped out temporarily, then temporarily became the arrangement, and then the arrangement became invisible because no one talked about it directly. It was simply what was. By the time she'd looked up and noticed that her camera had been in the closet for 3 years, the editorial contact had gone cold, and the weddings had been given to someone younger who was actively pursuing them. She had not blamed Nathaniel for that. She had told herself it was a choice she'd made freely. She had believed that. Sitting in the driveway of her sister's house, she was no longer entirely sure what she had believed and what she had simply told herself in order to keep the peace. What she knew was this: she was 41 years old. She had skills that had not disappeared simply because she had stopped using them. She had an eye that had taken years to develop. She had contacts that might be dormant, but were not dead. She was not starting over. She was continuing something that had been interrupted. There was a difference. She needed to remember that there was a difference. She went inside and helped Madeline make dinner. On Monday morning at 8:52, Daniel Prescott's assistant called her back and offered her an 11 o'clock appointment. She was there at 10:45. Daniel Prescott was not what she had imagined. She'd expected someone imposing, someone with the particular energy of a person who made a living from other people's worst moments and had developed a corresponding gravity. He was instead a mild-looking man in his mid-50s with wire-rimmed glasses and the unhurried manner of someone who had learned through long practice that panic was never useful and that the best thing you could do for a client in crisis was model calm. He looked at the documents she brought. He was quiet while he read through them. He asked several specific questions. He took notes. Then he looked up at her and said, "You were thorough." "I had help," she said. "My sister told me what to look for." "Your sister has good instincts." He set down his pen. "Mrs. Carter, what I'm looking at here suggests several things. The hidden account, the characterization of certain property expenditures. I want to be careful about what I tell you at this stage because we need to verify, but I want you to understand that what you brought me today is meaningful." What does that mean in practical terms? It means you're not walking into this unprepared, and that matters more than most people realize. Clara sat with that for a moment. "He thinks I'll be devastated," she said. "He thinks I'll spend the next few months falling apart, and that by the time I come up for air, he'll have already arranged things the way he wants them arranged. That's a common assumption." "He's wrong," she said. Daniel Prescott regarded her over his glasses. "Yes," he said, "I believe he is." She drove home from that meeting with something she hadn't felt in a long time, something she'd almost forgotten had a name. Momentum. Not happiness. Not yet. But the specific sensation of being in motion, of facing in the right direction, of being the author of what happened next, rather than its subject. She thought about Nathaniel sitting in that restaurant, his phone face down on the table, his wish sitting between them like a grenade he'd finally decided to pull the pin on. She thought about what he'd expected, the tears, the begging, the negotiation, the long and painful arc of a woman trying to hold together something that had already been taken apart by someone else's choices. She thought about what he was going to get instead. Because Clara Whitmore, and she was already beginning to think of herself that way again, her own name, not Mrs. Carter, not his wife, but the name she'd been given and had given herself meaning through. Before any of this, Clara Whitmore was not going to give him the expected. She was going to do the unexpected. She was going to leave. Not in the way he anticipated, not with screaming and drama and the specific theater of a betrayed wife making her exit. She was going to leave with documentation, with an attorney, with a plan, with the kind of quiet, devastating competence that had always been available to her, even when she'd been operating as support staff in someone else's story. She was going to leave, and she was going to take her life back. Every piece of it. The photography. The sense of self she'd set aside so carefully she'd almost forgotten where she'd put it. The ability to walk into a room and know that what she brought to it was hers, not borrowed from someone else's identity or propped up by someone else's success. She got home. She made herself a cup of tea. She sat at the kitchen table in the house she had shared with Nathaniel for 4 years, and she opened her laptop and she looked up the contact information for 3 different photography studios in Charleston that she'd bookmarked years ago and never reached out to. She started writing emails. Her hands were not shaking. They were, if anything, steadier than they had ever been. And somewhere across town in an office building on East Bay Street, Nathaniel Carter was looking at his phone, waiting for a message from his wife that would tell him how things were going to go. He was still waiting. I would be waiting a long time. The emails she sent that Monday night were 3 short paragraphs each, professional, direct. She introduced herself by her maiden name, Clara Whitmore, not Carter. She wasn't sure she'd made that decision consciously, but once she noticed it, she didn't go back to change it. She attached a small portfolio she'd pulled from an old external hard drive she found in the closet behind her winter coats. The images were 4 years old. She looked at them before she attached them, really looked, and thought, these are still good. Whatever else Nathaniel had taken from her, he had not taken her eye. She hit send on all 3 emails and closed the laptop. Then she went to the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, and stood at the counter in the silence of a house that no longer felt like hers. Nathaniel hadn't come home Sunday night. He hadn't called. He'd sent one text at 11 p.m. that said, "We should talk soon." She had read it, set the phone face down on the nightstand, the same way he'd set his phone face down on that restaurant table, and gone to sleep. She slept better than she had in months. That surprised her. She'd expected insomnia, the specific torture of a mind that won't stop running the same reel over and over. Instead, she slept deeply and woke at 6 with a clarity she hadn't felt in so long it took her a moment to recognize it. No more lying beside someone and wondering. No more waiting for a warmth that wasn't coming. The worst thing had already happened. The not knowing was over. There was a strange, brutal freedom in that. She showered, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad writing down everything she needed to do. Not the emotional things. Those would come, she knew they would come at inconvenient hours in the middle of grocery store aisles, and they would come hard. But right now, this morning, she had a list to build and a life to start reclaiming, and that required her to function, so she would function. She was halfway through the list when Nathaniel walked in. He looked like he hadn't slept. His suit jacket was wrinkled in the specific way that meant he'd slept in it somewhere, and there was a quality to his face, a compression around the eyes that she recognized as guilt, wearing the mask of exhaustion. He stopped when he saw her at the table. She looked at him steadily and said nothing. "You were here," he said. "I live here," she said. He set his keys on the counter. He stood there for a moment like he was calculating something. Then he said, "I think we need to sit down and figure out how we're going to handle this." "I've already started figuring it out." Something shifted in his face. "What does that mean?" "It means I saw Daniel Prescott yesterday morning." The name landed. She watched him process it, watched the calculation behind his eyes, sharpen, watched something that might have been genuine surprise move through him before he got it under control. "You saw an attorney," he said. "I did. Clara, we haven't even talked. You talked on Friday night," she said. "You said everything you needed to say. I heard you." She picked up her coffee cup. "Now I'm taking the next steps." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and she noticed that he sat heavily with the weight of a man who had expected a different scene than the one he was in. He had expected tears, she thought. He had expected her to have spent the weekend in pieces, to be raw and begging and desperate for reassurance. He had not expected her to be sitting at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with a legal pad and an attorney already retained. "I made a mistake," he said. She looked at him. "Not about Victoria." He said it carefully, like he was navigating terrain he wasn't sure was solid. "About the way I told you, about all of it, the timing, how I handled it." "The mistake," Clara said slowly, "was not the timing, Nathaniel. The mistake was 8 months of a secret credit card and hotel stays in Atlanta, and the fact that you told me that dinner in Charlotte was a work meeting with a developer from Georgia. That was the mistake." His jaw tightened. "You went through my files." "I went through our files," she said. "Everything in that office was as much mine as yours. I've been running the administrative side of your business for 4 years. I know where everything is. I put most of it there." He was quiet. "And what I found," she continued, "was very educational." She could see him recalibrating. This was the version of Nathaniel she recognized from his professional life, the man who read a room, assessed the power dynamics, and adjusted his position accordingly. She had watched him do it in 100 negotiations. She had admired it once. Now she simply recognized it for what it was, and decided to let him know she recognized it. "I'm not interested in destroying you," she said. "I told Daniel that. I want a fair division of what we built together, and I want to move forward. That's all." "It's never that simple," he said. "It is if we're both reasonable." She stood, picked up her legal pad and coffee cup. "Think about whether you want to be reasonable." She walked out of the kitchen and left him sitting at the table. Her hands were trembling slightly when she reached the hallway, but she made herself keep walking, and she didn't let herself look back, and within 3 steps, the trembling had stopped. She was learning something about herself in these past 4 days, something she hadn't known. She knew that she was capable of more composure under pressure than she had ever been asked to produce before. And that composure was not the absence of feeling. It was feeling everything and choosing moment by moment what to do with it. She texted Madeline, "I talked to him. I'm okay. Call you tonight." Madeline texted back within 30 seconds. "Good. Keep moving." She did. She called the photography studios she'd emailed and confirmed she was available to meet. She drove to the copy center and made second copies of all the financial documents she'd given Daniel. She called her old college roommate Jessie, who was a graphic designer in Atlanta, and asked if she knew anyone who was looking for a photographer. Jessie said, "Oh my God, Clara, yes. My client needs someone for a product campaign next month. Are you available?" She said yes before she fully processed what she was agreeing to. When she hung up, she sat in the car in the copy center parking lot and let herself feel for exactly 90 seconds the dizzying mixture of terror and exhilaration that came with saying yes to something she hadn't done in 4 years. Then she started the car and drove to her next stop. Nathaniel called her 3 times that afternoon. She let all 3 go to voicemail. The first message said he thought they should try couples counseling before making any permanent decisions. The second said he wanted her to know that his relationship with Victoria was over, that he had ended it, that he hoped she understood that mattered. The third was just his voice, quieter than she'd heard it in years, saying her name once and then stopping and then saying, "I don't know what I expected. I think I expected less from you. I'm realizing now that I've always expected less from you. I think that might be the problem." She listened to all 3 while she sat in Madeline's driveway before going in for dinner. The third one she listened to twice. Then she deleted all 3 and went inside. Madeline had made pasta. They sat across from each other the way they'd been sitting across from each other since they were children, sharing a bedroom in their parents' house in Greenville. And Madeline poured wine and said, "How did it go?" He apologized for the timing. Madeline's eyebrows went up. "Not for the affair, for the timing." He got around to mentioning that Victoria was over, after. Clara twisted pasta on her fork. He sounded almost human on the third voicemail. "They always do," Madeline said, when they realize you're actually gone. Clara looked at her sister. Does it get easier? The part where you know you're doing the right thing, but it still feels like you're walking through wet concrete. Madeline didn't rush to answer. That was one of the things Clara valued most about her sister. She didn't throw comfort at you before she'd taken the question seriously. Yes, she finally said, but not because the grief goes away. It gets easier because the person you're becoming starts to take up more space than the person you lost, and eventually the becoming is louder than the losing. Clara let that sit. I sent emails to 3 studios, she said. Jesse's client wants me for a product campaign next month. Madeline set down her wine glass. Clara. I know. That's Clara that's fast. I know. She looked at her sister. I'm afraid if I slow down, I'll stop. I know myself well enough to know that. So I'm not slowing down. Madeline studied her for a long moment. You're going to be all right, she said, not as comfort, as assessment. I know, Clara said, and for the first time since Friday night she believed it. The weeks that followed moved with a particular kind of double time that Clara would later struggle to describe accurately. On one track, her life was being dismantled, the legal paperwork, the formal separation, the first terrible conversation with Nathaniel in Daniel Prescott's conference room, where everything they had owned together was laid out on a table in columns and assigned a value. On another track, entirely simultaneously, her life was being built, and the building track was moving faster than she had any right to expect. The product campaign with Jesse's client went well. Exceptionally well. In fact, the client was a sustainable clothing brand based in Charleston called Meridian Thread, owned by a woman named Patricia Okafor, who had very specific ideas about the aesthetic she wanted, and the most genuine open appreciation for what Clara did with natural light that Clara had experienced in years. Patricia walked through the images at the end of the second shoot day and stopped in front of one particular shot and said nothing for almost a full minute. Then she said, "Who told you you were done?" Clara blinked. "Excuse me." "Your work," Patricia said, gesturing at the screen. "Who told you that you were done? Because whoever it was, they were lying to you. This is extraordinary." Clara stood there in Patricia Okafor's studio and felt something shift behind her sternum, something that had been compressed for 4 years by the weight of being invisible, suddenly having room to expand. "I sort of told myself," she said finally. "Well," Patricia said, "stop listening to yourself about that particular topic." She booked Clara for a 3-month campaign. Clara drove home from that meeting and called Madeline and cried on the phone for 20 minutes, not from sadness or not only from sadness, but from the specific, overwhelming quality of understanding, viscerally and suddenly, that you were capable of something you had almost convinced yourself you'd outgrown. She had been so careful to build a story in her head where stepping away from her career had been a mutual decision, a rational trade-off, something she'd chosen with open eyes. That story had protected her from a more uncomfortable truth, that she had been slowly disappearing not all at once, but increment by increment, and she had told herself the disappearing was voluntary. It wasn't. She was not going to disappear anymore. Around the same time, Daniel Prescott called with an update that changed the landscape of the divorce significantly. He had retained a forensic accountant, a woman named Ruth Calder, who had the specific manner of someone who had spent decades in rooms full of men trying to hide money and had developed accordingly, and Ruth had found something. Clara listened to Daniel explain it in the measured, careful way he explained everything, and when he was done, she was quiet for a moment. "He transferred it," she said. "6 months ago," Daniel confirmed, "before you had any indication apparently that things were heading toward dissolution. The transfer moved roughly $240,000 from the joint investment account into an LLC he formed specifically for that purpose. The LLC is registered under a slightly modified version of his company name, different enough that it wouldn't appear in a casual search." Clara thought about that. She thought about the months she'd spent during that period believing the distance between them was stress and overwork. She thought about the weekend in Savannah, which happened 3 months after the transfer, where she had believed they were trying. "He was planning this," she said, "before I knew there was anything to plan for." "The evidence suggests the situation was further along than he disclosed on Friday," Daniel said with the restraint of a man choosing his words from a very specific set. "What does this mean for us?" "It means Ruth's report goes into the filing. It means the hidden asset becomes part of the documented record. It changes the conversation considerably." Clara pressed her hand flat against the surface of the table she was sitting at, feeling the solid reality of it. "He thought I wouldn't notice," she said. "He thought I handled the administrative side, but didn't understand the financial structure well enough to catch it." "That appears to have been his assumption, yes." "He was wrong." "He was significantly wrong," Daniel said. She hung up and sat very still for a long moment. Then she called Madeline. "He hid money," she said when her sister picked up. A pause. Then, "Of course he did. $240,000 6 months ago. Before you knew." "Before I knew." Madeline was quiet for a beat. "That's premeditated, Clara. That's not a man who fell into an affair and lost his way. That's a man who was running 2 parallel tracks and making financial preparations while you were in the house." Clara closed her eyes. "I know. How are you feeling?" She thought about it honestly. "Angry," she said, "but not surprised. And that's almost the worst part, that I'm not surprised, because I think some part of me always understood that I trusted him more than he earned. You loved him. I did. And I was careful with that love. I treated it seriously." She exhaled. "He didn't." She met with Daniel and Ruth together the following week. Ruth Calder was a compact woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a chain and the crisp efficiency of someone who had seen every variety of financial dishonesty and was no longer capable of being shocked by any of it. She walked Clara through the findings the same way she might walk someone through a grocery list, matter-of-fact precise, without editorializing. When she was done, she looked at Clara over her glasses and said, "You came in prepared. Most wives don't." "My sister warned me," Clara said. "Your sister sounds like someone worth listening to." "She's the smartest person I know." Ruth nodded once. "The transfer is documented. The LLC is documented. The credit card expenditures are documented. This is a clean evidentiary picture, which will make the negotiation considerably more efficient." "I don't want a war," Clara said. "I've said that from the beginning. I want what's fair." Ruth looked at her with the specific expression of someone who respects directness. "Fair is achievable," she said, "particularly now." The formal settlement negotiations began 2 weeks later. Nathaniel walked into Daniel Prescott's conference room with his own attorney, a man named Gregory Hale, who was younger than Daniel, more aggressively styled with the energy of someone who'd been briefed to be formidable. Clara recognized immediately that Nathaniel had chosen Gregory because he wanted to win, not because he wanted to be fair. She'd expected as much. She sat across from her husband, almost former husband. She corrected herself and kept her hands flat on the table and her breathing even. Gregory opened by suggesting that the joint investment account had been legitimately restructured for business purposes, and that the transfer into the LLC was a routine corporate maneuver that had nothing to do with the dissolution. Daniel let him finish. Then Daniel said, "We have Ruth Calder's full forensic accounting report, which documents the timeline of the transfer in relationship to the formation of the LLC, and contextualizes it against the existing marital asset record. We're happy to submit it in full at any stage of this process." Gregory looked at his client. Nathaniel was looking at Clara. She met his eyes. She did not look away. "This is not what I wanted," Nathaniel said. He was speaking to her directly past the attorneys, past the paperwork. "I want you to know that." "What you wanted," Clara said quietly, "was a life with someone else and a settlement where I didn't know enough to object to what you offered. That's what you wanted." She held his gaze. "But that's not what's happening." The room was very quiet. Gregory started to say something. Nathaniel stopped him with a slight movement of his hand. "What do you want?" Nathaniel asked her. "I want my photography business funded for the first year of operation," she said. "I want the fair division of our marital assets, as Ruth has documented them, including the transferred funds. I want the house sold and the equity split according to what Daniel's filing establishes. And I want my name back." Nathaniel stared at her. "Your name," he said. "Whitmore," she said. "My name is Clara Whitmore." Something moved across his face, not remorse exactly, but something in the same family. Something that recognized, perhaps for the first time with full clarity, the specific size of what he was losing. "Okay," he said. Gregory turned to him sharply. "Nathaniel, we should discuss." "I said okay." Nathaniel kept his eyes on Clara. "She gets what she's asking for." She had not expected it to be that clean. She'd prepared herself for months of back and forth of delays and counters, and the specific exhaustion of a legal process designed by both sides to wear the other down. Instead, in Daniel Prescott's conference room on a Wednesday afternoon, it was done in principle within the hour. She understood later. Daniel helped her understand that Nathaniel had conceded not only because the forensic accounting made his position untenable, but because Clara had come in knowing exactly what she wanted. There was nothing to negotiate around. She had been specific and reasonable and immovable, and there was no gap in her position for Gregory Hale to find purchase in. She walked out of that meeting and sat in her car and put her hands on the steering wheel and breathed. She thought about the person who had walked into that restaurant wearing a blue dress and hoping for an anniversary dinner. She thought about how certain she had been that night, that her job was to try harder to be warmer, to find the right combination of words that would remind Nathaniel of what they'd once had. She thought about all the trying she'd done over the course of the past year quietly, without acknowledgement in a marriage that was already somewhere else. She was done trying to be enough for someone who had already decided she wasn't. She was going to try for herself now. She pulled out her phone and texted Patricia Okafor, "The shoot dates for the fall campaign, I'm confirmed. I'm ready." Patricia texted back immediately, "Amazing. Also, I referred you to a friend. She owns 3 boutique hotels in the Low Country and needs someone for their rebrand. Expect a call from Simone Tran." Clara read the message twice, then she started the car. She had a studio space to look at. She had booked a viewing for a small commercial space in the North Central neighborhood, not expensive, manageable with the settlement funds. She was now more confident would materialize, and the listing had natural light on the east side that the realtor had described as exceptional. She was going to see it for herself. She was going to see what exceptional looked like now in this new life she was building out of the wreckage of the old one, and she was going to decide for herself whether it was enough to work with. Everything she had ever needed, she was beginning to understand, was already hers. She had just spent 5 years letting someone else tell her otherwise. That was over. She drove toward the light. Simone Tran called on a Thursday morning 2 days after Patricia's text, while Clara was standing in the middle of the studio space in North Central with a measuring tape in one hand and her phone in the other. She almost didn't answer. Unknown number. But something made her pick up. "Is this Clara Whitmore?" The voice was precise, quick, with the cadence of someone who scheduled their time in 15-minute increments and didn't apologize for it. "It is. Patricia Okafor gave me your name. I'm Simone Tran. I own the Harlow Collection 3 boutique properties along the South Carolina coast. We're doing a full rebrand, and I need a photographer who understands light and authenticity. Patricia said you were the only person she'd recommend without hesitation." A brief pause. "She doesn't say that about anyone." Clara looked at the east-facing wall of the studio space, where morning light was doing exactly what the listing had promised. Exceptional. "I'm available," she said. "When do you want to meet?" They met 4 days later at the flagship Harlow property in Beaufort. Simone was 48, Vietnamese-American, built her hotel portfolio from a single inherited property. Her grandmother had left her, and had the specific self-possession of a woman who had spent 2 decades making decisions in rooms where people underestimated her and had stopped finding it interesting. She and Clara sat on the hotel's wraparound porch and talked for 2 hours, and what began as a portfolio review turned into something closer to a creative conversation, the kind Clara hadn't had in years, where both people in the room were genuinely thinking rather than performing. "What have you been doing for the past 4 years?" Simone asked, not unkindly. "Supporting someone else's vision," Clara said. Simone looked at her for a moment. "And now, building my own." Simone nodded once slowly with the manner of a woman who recognized that answer because she had lived a version of it herself. "The campaign budget is significant," she said. "I don't work with people who are still finding their confidence. I need someone who walks onto a location and already knows what they're looking for." "I know what I'm looking for," Clara said. "I always have. I just stopped acting on it for a while." "Why?" Clara considered. "Because I thought that was what love required." Simone held her gaze. "And now? Now I understand the difference between love and erasure." Another pause, longer this time. Then Simone picked up her coffee cup and said, "I want to show you the second property. Bring your camera." Clara brought her camera. She shot for 3 hours across the second Harlow location, moving through the space the way she used to move instinctively, following light and shadow and the geometry of a scene before her mind had fully articulated what she was chasing. When she pulled the images up on her laptop that evening, something she hadn't felt in a very long time rose in her chest, the specific satisfaction of work that was fully and undeniably hers. Not derivative, not compromised, not produced in service of someone else's requirements. Just her eye, her instinct, her understanding of what made a moment worth preserving. She sent 20 of the images to Simone at 9 that evening with a single line, "Let me know what you think." Simone responded at 9:14, "I think you start Monday." Clara set her phone down on the table in the studio space she had officially leased that afternoon and looked at the empty room around her. Her studio, her lease, her name on the contract, Clara Whitmore Photography. She sat down on the floor because there was no furniture yet and pressed her back against the wall and let herself feel everything that had accumulated over the past 3 weeks. The grief, the anger, the fear, the exhilaration, all of it at once, none of it canceling any other part out. She cried for about 10 minutes. Not the broken crying of the night she'd arrived at Madeline's. Something cleaner. Something that felt like a pressure valve releasing rather than a foundation cracking. Then she wiped her face, stood up, and started measuring for shelving. She was not going to stop moving. It was around this time, 3 weeks after the anniversary dinner, 10 days after the settlement conference, that the calls from Nathaniel changed in character. The first wave had been strategic. The voicemails about counseling, about how Victoria was over, about the timing of his honesty. Clara had recognized all of those as the moves of a man trying to manage a situation that had escaped his control. She'd listened, filed them away, deleted them. The second wave was different. He started calling at odd hours. Not late-night desperation calls, nothing that dramatic, but 7:45 in the morning on a Tuesday or 2:15 on a Sunday afternoon times that didn't feel calculated, that felt instead like impulse. The messages were shorter and less polished. One of them was just, "I drove past Cypress Street today, and I don't know why I'm calling. I'm sorry, that's all." Another was, "You sent Patricia Okafor work, and she showed me your shots from the Meridian campaign. Clara." A pause in the message long enough that she thought he'd hung up. Then, "You were always this good. I don't know why I'm saying this. Forget it." She didn't forget it. She didn't call back either. But she held his words in a place separate from where she was making her decisions, and she let herself be honest about what they cost her. Because it would have been easier in some ways to have a villain, a man who felt nothing, who had never loved her, who had used her systematically and moved on without a backward glance. That story would have been simpler, cleaner. The anger would have been uncomplicated. Instead, she had this a man who had loved her, or some version of her, and had still chosen to betray her. A man who was only now understanding the full weight of what he'd traded away too late in voicemails she didn't return. That was harder to carry than pure hatred would have been. She talked to Daniel Prescott about it in one of their check-in calls. "He's calling," she said. "Different tone now, not strategic, something else." "That's common," Daniel said. "The reality of the dissolution becomes concrete. Assets are being formally divided. The finality registers." "He sounds like he's grieving." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "He may be." "Is that supposed to make me feel something?" "I think you already feel something," Daniel said. "The question is what you're going to do with it." Clara thought about that. "Nothing," she said finally. "I'm going to feel it and do nothing. Because whatever he's grieving, he chose, and I didn't get to choose." "That," Daniel said, "is a very healthy position." She allowed herself one moment of dark humor. "My therapist would agree with you." She'd started seeing a therapist named Dr. Anita Reeves 2 weeks after the anniversary. Madeline had suggested it, gently framing it not as a crisis intervention, but as a maintenance decision, the kind of thing you did when your life was being reconstructed from the ground up, and you wanted to make sure you were rebuilding on solid ground rather than compressed grief. Clara had gone once skeptically and come back the following week and the week after that. Dr. Reeves was a direct woman in her early 60s who had a habit of asking the question underneath the question, the one Clara was actually avoiding with the calm efficiency of someone who had done it so many times that she no longer needed to make a production of it. In their 4th session, Dr. Reeves asked, "What's the earliest memory you have of making yourself smaller for someone you loved?" Clara opened her mouth to say something about Nathaniel and then stopped. because the image that came unbidden and completely clear was not of her husband. It was of herself at 23, turning down an editorial assignment in New York because her then-boyfriend at the time said long distance was too hard. She had framed it as a mutual decision. She had believed that framing for years. "Oh," she said. Dr. Reeves waited. "It's a pattern," Clara said. "Tell me about it." She talked for 40 minutes without stopping. About the boyfriend at 23, about the way she'd always positioned her ambitions as negotiable and her relationships as fixed. About how she'd constructed a self-narrative where her sacrifices were choices, because calling them sacrifices would have required her to be angry about them, and being angry about them would have required her to blame people she loved, and blaming people she loved felt like a kind of disloyalty she couldn't tolerate. "So you tolerated something else instead," Dr. Reeves said. "I tolerated disappearing," Clara said. "And now," Clara looked at her, "now I'm learning to take up space." The Harlow campaign launched its first shoot week in early October, 6 weeks after the anniversary dinner. Clara arrived at the first location before sunrise, which was her preference. She liked to be inside a space before the light changed, to understand its bones before the day started performing. She set up alone methodically in the specific focused silence that she'd forgotten she loved. Simone arrived at 7 with 2 assistants and a stylist and moved through the space with the same purposeful efficiency Clara had come to recognize as her default mode. They'd developed in the 2 weeks of pre-production a working shorthand. Simone articulated the feeling she wanted, and Clara translated it into specifics without requiring long explanations. It was the rarest thing in a professional relationship, genuine alignment. "You're different from other photographers I've worked with," Simone said during a break, handing Clara a coffee. "Different how?" "You're not shooting the space. You're shooting the experience of being in it." Simone considered. "That's hard to teach." "It took a long time to learn," Clara said, "and then I stopped practicing it for a while." "What made you start again?" Clara wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "Someone told me I wasn't enough, and I believed them for about 72 hours. Then I stopped." Simone looked at her with the expression Clara was beginning to recognize, the one that meant she was recalibrating something. "Good," she said simply, and went back to work. The day the divorce was finalized was a Wednesday in mid-October, 43 days after the anniversary dinner. Daniel called her at 11:17 in the morning. "It's done," he said. "Everything we filed has been approved. The settlement terms stand. The house goes to market next week. Your accounts have been separated." Clara was in her studio when the call came, editing the Harlow images on her new monitor, the morning light coming through the east-facing window exactly the way she'd known it would. She set down her stylus and sat for a moment with the phone in her hand. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." "You made my job straightforward," Daniel said. "You came in prepared and you knew what you wanted. That's rarer than you'd think." She hung up and sat with the finality of it. 43 days. That was how long it had taken to legally dismantle 5 years. She'd expected to feel more devastated by that math. Instead, what she felt was something closer to the specific exhaustion that comes after a long physical effort. Not defeat, not grief, just the weight of something completed. She had done everything she needed to do. She had done it clearly and without self-destruction. She had come through. She texted Madeline, "It's done." Madeline called immediately. "Are you okay?" "Yeah," Clara said, and meant it. "Where are you?" "The studio." "Of course you are." She could hear her sister smiling. "I'm taking you to dinner tonight, non-negotiable." "Okay. Somewhere nice. Wear the blue dress." Clara paused. "That dress has complicated associations." "Which is exactly why you should put it back on," Madeline said. "Take it back." She wore the blue dress. They went to a different restaurant. No candlelit corner tables, no careful reservations, just a lively place in the French Quarter, with good wine and a noise level that made it impossible to be overly serious. Madeline brought flowers, which she handed over with the dry ceremony of someone who had learned that sentiment was best expressed quickly before embarrassment set in. Clara laughed genuinely for the first time in 6 weeks. They ordered too much food. They talked about everything and nothing. They talked about Madeline's daughter, who was applying to colleges, and about the studio space, and about the Harlow campaign, and about the client Patricia had referred, who had called yesterday, wanting to discuss a potential long-term contract. "You're moving fast," Madeline said. "I know. I mean that as an observation, not a warning." "I know," Clara said again. I think if I slow down before I've built enough momentum, the grief will catch up and pin me. I'm not running from it. I'm just staying ahead of it until I've got enough foundation under me that it can't knock me flat. Madeline looked at her sister across the table. You sound different than you used to. I am different. Good different. I think so. Clara turned her wine glass slowly. I think the person I was in that marriage was real, but she was a compressed version of herself. Like, you know, when you save a file and the quality drops, that's what I was. A compressed version that had lost some resolution. She looked up. I'm getting the resolution back. Madeline raised her glass. To resolution. Clara raised hers. To resolution. What happened 3 days later, Clara did not see coming. She was in the studio mid-afternoon working through the second round of Harlow edits when her phone rang. A Charleston number she didn't recognize. She picked up out of habit. Ms. Whitmore, this is Kevin Marsh from the Charleston Arts Foundation. I'm calling because we received a portfolio submission under your name from a recommender. I'm not at liberty to say who for our Emerging Voices grant. I know you didn't submit this yourself, so I want to be transparent about how it came to us. But I also want to tell you that your work has been reviewed by our selection committee, and we'd like to invite you to a formal interview. Clara set down her stylus. I'm sorry, she said. Someone submitted my portfolio to your grant program. That's correct. The submission included recent work from the Meridian Thread campaign, as well as some older editorial work from your earlier career. The committee found the range compelling. The Emerging Voices grant is $15,000 and includes a sponsored exhibition at our spring showcase. She asked Kevin Marsh if she could call him back in 20 minutes. He said of course. She hung up and called Patricia Okafor immediately. Did you submit my portfolio to the Charleston Arts Foundation? She asked. A brief pause. I might have done something like that. Patricia. You weren't going to do it yourself. I watched you in that studio, and I thought this woman is rebuilding, and she doesn't fully see yet how good she is. So I gave the committee something to look at. Another pause. Are you angry? Clara pressed her hand against the surface of her work table. She thought about being angry. She tested the feeling. She wasn't angry. No, she said. I'm grateful. Good. Then call them back and get that interview. She called Kevin Marsh back and confirmed. The interview was scheduled for the following Thursday. She spent the intervening days preparing with the same methodical energy she'd applied to everything since the anniversary. Not obsessively, not from fear, but from the belief that things worth doing were worth doing with full attention. She put together a presentation. She wrote a statement about her work and what she was building with Clara Whitmore Photography, and what she believed photography could do for the documentation of lives and businesses that were often underrepresented in commercial spaces. She read the statement to Dr. Reeves in their session the day before the interview. Dr. Reeves listened with her hands folded and her expression neutral in the specific way that meant she was tracking something carefully. When Clara finished, Dr. Reeves said, "Read me the second paragraph again." Clara looked down at the page. The second paragraph talked about photographing the experience of being in a space rather than the space itself. About how the best images were the ones that captured what a moment felt like, not just what it looked like. About how she had always believed that and had lost access to that belief for a while and was reclaiming it. She read it again. "Do you hear yourself?" Dr. Reeves said. "What do you mean?" "6 weeks ago, you described yourself to me as a compressed file that had lost resolution." Dr. Reeves gestured at the paper in Clara's hands. "That's not a compressed file." Clara looked at what she'd written. She thought about the woman in the blue dress sitting across from a man who'd wished her away, hands still in her lap, world tilting on its axis. She thought about that woman driving to her sister's house and making a list and calling an attorney and signing a lease and showing up before sunrise to a shoot because she loved the light before the day started performing. "No," she said quietly, "it's not." The interview with the Charleston Arts Foundation lasted 90 minutes. Kevin Marsh led a panel of 4 visual artists, a curator and a nonprofit director, and they asked questions that were genuinely rigorous. Not soft questions designed to make an applicant feel good. Questions that required real answers. She gave real answers. She talked about craft and intention and what she believed documentary-adjacent commercial photography could accomplish when it was done without condescension. She talked about the gap between how small businesses were typically photographed and how they actually existed. She talked about Simone Tran and Patricia Okafor and what she was learning about building a creative practice that could sustain itself financially without compromising aesthetically. She did not mention Nathaniel. She did not mention the marriage or the anniversary dinner or the 8 months of a secret credit card or the specific texture of sitting in a restaurant in a blue dress and having your 5-year marriage dismissed by a man reading a message from someone named Victoria. She did not need to. That story had done its work on her. It had compressed her and cracked her open and forced her to reckon with things she'd been carefully not reckoning with for a decade. She was grateful for none of the pain and grateful for all of what it had produced. She thanked the panel and left. Kevin Marsh called her the following Monday morning. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, "I'm pleased to tell you the committee has made its decision." She was standing at the window of her studio, coffee in hand, watching the street below. "The grant is yours," he said. "Congratulations." She stood very still for a moment. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady. She was beginning to expect that of herself, the steadiness. "The exhibition will be in March," Kevin said. "We'll be in touch about specifics, but I want to add something personally if that's all right." The committee commented specifically on your statement. The part about photographing what a moment feels like, not just what it looks like. One of our panel members said she'd been waiting for someone to articulate that in exactly those terms. He paused. "We think you're going to do important work." She thanked him again and hung up. She stood at that window for a long time, looking out at the street, at the ordinary Tuesday morning movement of people living their ordinary lives, and she thought about what important work meant, what it required, what it had cost her to get back to a place where someone else could see it in her. She thought about Nathaniel listening to her voicemail ring. She thought about how little that mattered now. Not because she was over it. She was not over it, not entirely. And Dr. Reeves had been clear with her that grief was not linear and that there would be days, many days still, when the weight of it would surprise her. But because the ache of what she'd lost had been joined by something larger, something that was taking up the space that the marriage had occupied and filling it with something that was entirely and undeniably hers. She called Madeline. "I got it," she said. A sound on the other end that was not quite a word. "I got the grant," Clara said. "Exhibition in March, $15,000. Madeline made the sound again, and then she said in a voice that was doing its absolute best to stay composed and not quite managing Clara Whitmore. "Yeah, you know what this means. Tell me." "It means that man did you the biggest favor of his life when he shoved that gift off the table." Clara stood at the window of her studio with the phone pressed to her ear and the morning light coming through the glass at the angle she had chosen specifically because she understood exactly what it would do, and she felt something settle in her chest. Not peace, not yet, but the precursor to peace. The moment when the ground stops moving and you understand that what you're standing on is solid. "Yeah," she said, "I think you might be right." She had a shoot in an hour. She had edits due by Friday. She had an exhibition to start planning and a grant to allocate, and a business that was against every reasonable expectation she'd allowed herself 6 weeks ago, beginning to breathe. She set down her coffee and picked up her camera. She had work to do. The grant money hit her account on a Thursday morning in early November, and Clara sat with her laptop open looking at the number for a full minute before she closed it and went back to editing. She didn't celebrate immediately. She made a list instead the way she'd been making lists since the night she drove to Madeline's house, because lists were the architecture of forward motion, because as long as she was writing down the next thing she needed to do, she was not standing still in the rubble of the old life. Equipment she needed. A second assistant to hire for the Harlow final shoot week. The exhibition planning conversation she needed to have with Kevin Marsh. A website redesign that Jessie had been pushing her toward for 3 weeks. The list filled a page and a half. She made coffee, sat at her work table, and started working through it item by item. That was November. The weeks that followed compressed into a kind of productive blur that Clara would later look back on as the period when the life she was building stopped feeling provisional and started feeling real. Not perfect, not complete, but real in the way that only things built by your own hands can feel, with the specific texture of effort in them, the evidence of choice, the weight of something that belongs entirely to you because you made every decision that went into it. The Harlow campaign wrapped its final shoot week on a Tuesday in mid-November. Simone stood beside Clara at the editing bay on the last afternoon and looked at the full collection of images spread across the screen, and she was quiet for a long time in the way that people are quiet when they're genuinely moved and don't want to perform the emotion. Then she said, "I want to extend the contract." Clara turned to look at her. "I want you as the exclusive photographer for the Harlow collection for the next 2 years," Simone said. "All 3 properties, all campaigns, all social content, all editorial work we produce. I want your name attached to everything we put out visually." She paused. "I'm prepared to offer you a retainer, monthly, regardless of active shoot weeks." Clara held the offer for a moment. The old Clara, the compressed version, the one who had spent years operating as support staff in someone else's story, would have said yes immediately, grateful for the security, grateful to be wanted. She recognized that impulse and let it pass. "I need to know what exclusivity means for the rest of my client list," she said. "I have the Meridian Thread contract, the Arts Foundation exhibition, and 2 other clients in negotiation. I'm not willing to dissolve those relationships." Simone looked at her with an expression Clara had come to recognize as respect. "Hospitality and lifestyle exclusivity," she said. "You can continue everything else. And the retainer covers my time, not just active shoots. Pre-production creative consultation, post-production direction." "Agreed." "Then yes," Clara said. "I'd like that." They shook hands in the specific way that 2 women who recognize each other as equals shake hands direct brief without the performance of ceremony. Clara drove home that evening and sat in her apartment. Her apartment, not the house on Cypress Street, not Madeline's guest room. Hers, the one she'd signed the lease on 4 weeks ago. 3rd floor, east-facing, good light. And she thought about the trajectory of the past 2 months. 43 days to finalize a divorce. 8 weeks to sign 2 major contracts and receive a grant and open a studio and lease an apartment and begin the construction of a life that was by every measurable standard larger than the one she'd been living inside the marriage. She thought about that. She was not naive enough to call it simple. The grief was still there. It arrived without warning the way Dr. Reeves had promised it would, in the middle of grocery runs in the specific quality of Sunday mornings when the apartment was quiet, and she was aware of the silence in a way she hadn't been during the marriage, because during the marriage the silence had felt normal, and now it felt like a presence. She was learning to sit with that presence without trying to fill it or fix it. She was learning slowly that solitude was not the same as loneliness. That was the ongoing work, the interior work, the kind that didn't show up in contracts or grant letters or camera equipment lists. It was the most important work she was doing. Then the call came that she had not expected. It was a Saturday afternoon in late November, cold for Charleston, the kind of gray day that made the inside of her apartment feel like a deliberate shelter. She was on her 2nd coffee going through the Arts Foundation exhibition notes with Kevin Marsh's latest email open beside her laptop when her phone rang. Nathaniel. She stared at his name on the screen for 3 full rings. She had not spoken to him directly since the settlement conference. The voicemails had tapered off in October. The last one had been the one about Patricia's photos, the one where he'd said her name and then stopped and she had listened to it twice and then deleted it and gone back to work. She had thought or allowed herself to believe that the voicemail chapter was over. She picked up. "Clara." His voice was different from any version she'd heard in the past 2 months. Not the strategic tone from the kitchen conversation, not the compressed guilt of the early voicemails. Something rawer, something that sounded like a man who had stopped calculating and was simply talking. I know I don't have the right to call. I know that. But I need to tell you something, and I need to say it directly, not in a voicemail." She said nothing. She waited. "Victoria left," he said, 2 weeks ago. She said she realized she didn't love me. She loved what my life looked like from the outside. She said the version of me she fell for was the version I performed at the beginning, and the real version wasn't what she signed up for. A pause. She used almost those exact words. Clara held the phone and looked at the wall. "I'm not telling you because I want something," he said. "I know there's nothing to want. I know what I destroyed. I'm telling you because I've been sitting in this house for 2 weeks thinking about what you said in Daniel's conference room, that I expected less from you. I've been thinking about what that means, about how long I'd been doing that before I even knew I was doing it. Nathaniel, let me finish, please." A breath. "You were the best thing in my life. I didn't see it clearly until you were gone. And then I tried to replace what I'd broken by holding on to someone who was never real to begin with. And now I'm sitting here and I'm not asking for another chance, Clara. I know better than to ask for that. I just need you to know that I see it. What I had, what I chose to throw away, I see it completely now. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside her window, the gray day was doing what gray days do, pressing impatient, indifferent. "Thank you for saying that," she finally said. "That's all. What did you expect me to say?" A silence. "I don't know. I think I expected you to be angrier." "I was angry," she said. "For a while I was angrier than I've ever been in my life. But anger is expensive, and I needed that energy for something else." She paused. "I'm sorry Victoria left. I am genuinely. Not because I think you deserve to be alone. I don't think that. But because being left by someone who decided you weren't what they wanted is one of the worst feelings there is. I know that now personally." The silence on his end had a quality to it she couldn't fully read. "You're a better person than I was to you," he said. "I'm the same person I always was," she said. "You just didn't look closely enough to see it." She heard him exhale, long, ragged, the kind of exhale that carries more than air. "Are you happy?" he asked. "I heard through mutual people that things are going well." "Things are going very well," she said. "I have a studio. I have a 2-year contract with a hotel group. I got a grant from the Charleston Arts Foundation. I have an exhibition in March." "The photography." "Yes." Another silence. "I remember when you sold your camera equipment to cover the deposit on the Hargrove property," he said. "You said it was fine. I let you say it." She had forgotten about the camera equipment, or she had buried it. The memory surfaced now, sharp-edged and specific, the year they were expanding the business, when cash was tight, when she had quietly sold her secondary equipment because the deposit needed to be covered and he'd needed to close the deal. She had said it was fine. He had let her say it. "Yeah," she said quietly. "You did. I'm sorry." The 2 words were flat and genuine and utterly insufficient, and they both knew it. And she suspected that was exactly why he'd said them, because they were the most honest thing he could offer. Not a reparation, not an argument, just an acknowledgement. "I know," she said. "Take care of yourself, Clara." "I always did," she said. "You just didn't notice." She hung up and sat with the phone in her hand for a long moment. The gray day outside was unchanged. The exhibition notes were still open on her laptop. Her second coffee had gone cold. She thought about what Dr. Reeves would say when she told her about the call. She thought about Madeline, who would probably make a sound that wasn't a word, and then say something precise and exactly right. She thought about the camera equipment, the deposit on the Hargrove property, the year she'd told herself it was fine, and believed it because the alternative, believing it wasn't fine. Believing she had been quietly trading pieces of herself for a relationship that wasn't honoring the trade, was too large to hold at the time. She could hold it now. She was larger than she used to be. She reheated her coffee. She opened the exhibition notes. She went back to work. The first person she told about the Nathaniel call, oddly, was not Madeline. It was Emily Lawson. Emily was the business partner. Clara hadn't expected, not in the formal contractual sense, but in the practical way that some collaborations become more than what you signed up for. Emily was 36, a marketing strategist who had built a boutique firm in Charleston, serving independent creative businesses, and Patricia Okafor had introduced them in early November with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly what she was engineering and saw no reason to be subtle about it. Their first meeting was supposed to be a 1-hour consultation about Clara's digital presence. It ran for 3.5 hours and produced a full marketing strategy, a social content framework, a referral network plan, and a genuine friendship that neither of them had been particularly looking for, but both recognized immediately. Emily was the person who, when Clara described the Nathaniel call, didn't soften it or amplify it. She just said, "He called because he's alone and he finally understands what that means. That's his work to do, not yours." "I know," Clara said. "Do you feel anything?" "Yes." "What?" Clara thought about it. "Clarity," she finally said. Like the last thing that was still blurry just came into focus. "I spent 2 months being angry and grieving and rebuilding, and I've been doing all of that while some small part of me was still waiting for him to fully understand what he did. And now he does, and that part can stop waiting." Emily looked at her across the coffee she'd brought to the studio. "That's remarkably well processed for someone who went through what you went through." "I have a good therapist and a terrifying sister. That'll do it." December arrived, and with it the particular acceleration of a year ending and a new one preparing to begin. Clara felt the acceleration in her chest, a productive kind of urgency, the sense of things moving in the right direction faster than she'd dared to plan for. The exhibition was 8 weeks away. Kevin Marsh had confirmed the gallery space and the opening night format, and Clara was selecting images, sequencing them, thinking about what she wanted the collection to say. She was calling it rooms, not literal rooms, but the concept of inhabiting a space, of being present in a place rather than passing through it. The title had come to her at 2 a.m. during a week when she wasn't sleeping well, and she'd written it on a notepad by the bed and looked at it in the morning and known it was right. Simone had seen the draft exhibition list and said, "3 of these images are from the Harlow campaign. I want to loan them to you officially for the exhibition. No attribution cost. The exposure is worth more than any fee." Patricia Okafor had said, "I'm coming to the opening. I'm bringing 12 people." Madeline had said, "I'm coming to the opening and I'm bringing champagne, and I refuse to discuss anything practical the entire evening." Dr. Reeves had said, "How do you feel about showing your work publicly after 4 years away?" Clara had sat with that question. "Terrified," she said, "but it's the good kind, the kind that means I'm doing something that matters." "Tell me the difference for you between the bad kind of terrified and the good kind." "The bad kind is standing still," Clara said. "It's the fear that locks your feet. The good kind is forward motion. It moves you toward the thing instead of away from it." Dr. Reeves wrote something down. She did that sometimes and never explained what she was writing, which Clara had decided was deliberate and probably wise. The week before Christmas, Nathaniel called one more time. She didn't pick up. He left a voicemail, his voice measured and without expectation. "The house sold. The final check should be processed through Daniel by end of month. I hope December is treating you well." A pause. "The photography, I'm glad you went back to it. I always knew you should have." She listened to it once, didn't call back, didn't delete it for 3 days, which she allowed herself without analysis. Then she deleted it and made dinner and called Madeline and talked about Christmas plans. She was spending Christmas at Madeline's the way she had every Christmas of her adult life, which had always been a point of mild tension with Nathaniel, who preferred holidays to be spent with his own family in their own house. She had accommodated that preference for 4 of their 5 married Christmases. This year she was going to Madeline's, and Madeline's daughter was going to be there, and Madeline was going to make her grandmother's sweet potato pie recipe that nobody had ever successfully replicated outside of this specific kitchen, and Clara was going to sit at that table and be completely uncomplicatedly present. She was very much looking forward to it. Christmas itself was exactly what she'd needed, loud and warm and disorganized in the specific way that only family gatherings can be, with Madeline's daughter Cora debating college choices at top volume, and Madeline's neighbor Frank showing up uninvited with a bottle of wine as he apparently did every year, and the sweet potato pie being perfect, and Clara sitting at the table with her second glass of wine thinking, this is what I'm building toward. Not the career, not the contracts, not the exhibition, though all of those were real and important. But this, the ability to be fully here, to not be half present, half braced for the emotional weather of someone who had stopped choosing her. She was fully here. That was the gift the year had given her at enormous cost. She took it with both hands. January came in hard cold, which was unusual for Charleston, and busy in a way that suited her exactly. The exhibition was 6 weeks out. Kevin Marsh had confirmed press coverage from 2 local arts publications. Emily had built a social campaign around the opening that had already generated more interest than Clara had expected. Patricia was, as promised, bringing 12 people. And then, in the second week of January, something happened that Clara had not anticipated from any direction. She was at the studio late afternoon doing a final pass through the exhibition sequence when her phone rang. A New York number she didn't recognize. "Ms. Whitmore," a man's voice, unhurried and warm. "My name is Robert Chen. I'm the senior photo editor at Current the magazine. I was forwarded your portfolio by a colleague who attended the Charleston Arts Foundation preview event last week. I was hoping we could talk." Clara set down her stylus. Current was not a regional publication. Current was a national magazine with a circulation of 3 million and a photography program that had launched careers. She had read Current in her 20s, had studied its visual language, the way a musician studied a master recording, had once imagined herself in its pages, and then set that imagining aside, because imagining was a luxury and practicality was what a person chose when they loved someone and wanted to be useful. "Of course," she said. Her voice was steady. She was committed to steadiness. "What would you like to talk about?" "We have a feature series launching in the spring, American Independent Businesses, women-owned, focused on the intersection of craft and commerce. We're looking for a photographer who can capture what these businesses feel like from the inside, not just what they look like." He paused. "Your work from the Harlow campaign specifically was what caught our eye, the way you shoot the experience of being somewhere rather than the place itself." Those were almost exactly the words she'd written in her Arts Foundation application statement. She thought about Kevin Marsh calling to tell her she'd gotten the grant, about Simone extending the contract, about Patricia submitting her portfolio without asking because she recognized something Clara was still learning to recognize in herself. She thought about a man pushing a small wrapped box off a table in a Charleston restaurant and going back to his phone. "Tell me more about the series," she said. Robert Chen talked for 20 minutes. Clara listened, asked 3 specific questions, took notes on the legal pad she kept beside her laptop. When he asked if she'd be interested in coming to New York for a conversation with the full editorial team, she said yes, without hesitation. "Wonderful," he said. "We're thinking mid-February. Would that work?" Mid-February. 5 months after the anniversary dinner. 5 months from the worst night of her life to a phone call from a national magazine. "Yes," she said. "Mid-February works perfectly." She hung up and sat in her studio, which she had chosen because the east-facing wall caught the morning light at exactly the angle she wanted, in the city she had lived in for 4 years, while being slowly made invisible by someone who had not understood what he had, and she thought about all the things that had happened to produce this moment. The filing, the forensic accounting, the conference room, the empty studio she had measured with a tape in one hand and her phone in the other, the emails with her maiden name, the product campaign, the hotel collection, the grant, the exhibition, the 2-year contract, the December that had been against all odds the most generative month of her professional life. And beneath all of it, holding all of it, up the fundamental decision she had made in the parking lot of a restaurant on the night her husband had made his wish out loud to leave. Not because she was weak, not because she had run, but because she had understood in the specific clarity of that first hour of devastating truth that staying would require her to keep being the compressed version. And the compressed version had run out of room. She called Madeline. "Current magazine just called," she said. The sound Madeline made was not a word, and it was not controlled, and Clara pressed the phone to her ear and laughed, really laughed, the full-body kind that comes from somewhere you didn't know you had access to, and outside her studio window. The January light was doing something beautiful with the cold air, and she watched it and thought, "I see you. I see exactly what you're doing, and I know exactly how to use it." She was Clara Whitmore. She was 41 years old. She was just getting started. And somewhere across the city in the house on Cypress Street that had just sold and was now someone else's, entirely. Nathaniel Carter sat alone in a rental apartment scrolling through a page he probably shouldn't have been looking at the images from the Charleston Arts Foundation preview that someone had posted with the caption, "Don't miss the room's exhibition. Clara Whitmore is doing something extraordinary." He looked at the images for a long time. He thought about the blue dress. He thought about the gift box hitting the floor. He thought about the word, finally the word he had chosen when he told her he was being honest, as if his decision to stop lying was a gift he was giving her. He set down the phone. He did not call. For once he understood that there was nothing left to say. The New York meeting was on a Wednesday, and Clara took the 6:15 train from Charleston because she wanted the extra hours in the city before she had to be anywhere, not to sightsee, not to calm herself down. She wanted to walk to feel the specific weight of a city that did not accommodate anyone's hesitation, that moved at a pace that demanded you either keep up or get out of the way. She had been to New York plenty of times in her life. She had never arrived on her own terms quite like this. No one to check in with, no itinerary built around someone else's schedule. Just her portfolio case, her legal pad, and the morning air coming off the Hudson. She walked 12 blocks to the current offices instead of taking a cab. She used those 12 blocks the way she used the hour before a shoot to arrive inside herself before she arrived anywhere else, to check in, to confirm that the steadiness she had been building for 5 months was still there, load-bearing and real. It was. Every step confirmed it. Robert Chen met her in the lobby with a handshake and a direct look and said, "Your work has been on the wall in our conference room since Tuesday. We printed 3 images from the Harlow campaign. The team has been looking at them for 2 days." Clara looked at him. "And?" "Come find out," he said. She followed him to the 11th floor. The conference room held 6 people, 3 editors, a photo researcher named Marcus, a creative director named Sonia, who sat at the far end of the table with her arms crossed and the specific expression of someone who had spent decades deciding what was worth her attention and had developed a corresponding economy of expression, and Robert. Clara's images were projected on the wall behind her at a size large enough to show every decision she had made, every choice about light composition, what to keep and what to let go. They asked her questions for 90 minutes, not soft questions, not questions designed to make her feel welcome, questions that assumed she could handle intellectual pressure and were running a test to confirm that assumption. Questions about technique and intention and what she believed photography owed its subjects. Questions about craft and commerce and where the line was between the two. She answered every one without hedging. She talked about the Harlow collection and the specific quality of coastal light in the early morning before the world started performing itself. She talked about the Meridian Thread campaign and what Patricia Okafor had understood instinctively about the relationship between a product and the person who made it. She talked about the Rooms exhibition, about the title, about what it meant to her to photograph the experience of inhabiting a space rather than the space itself, about why she believed that distinction was not an aesthetic preference, but an ethical one. Marcus, the photo researcher, leaned forward and said, "You keep using the word ethical. Explain that." "Because most commercial photography is a kind of lie," she said. "Not a malicious one, but it presents the idealized version of a thing rather than the true version. And when the subject is a business that someone built with their hands, that someone sacrificed for that idealization, becomes a form of erasure. It says the real thing isn't interesting enough. It says we need to make it look like something it isn't to make people care about it." She paused. "I disagree with that. The real version is almost always more compelling than the performance. My job is to find it and hold still long enough to let it be what it is." Sonja had not spoken for the first hour. She sat at the end of the table and observed without expression, and Clara had made a decision early in the meeting to stop positioning herself toward that silence and to simply speak to the whole room with equal attention. She had learned that lesson in Daniel Prescott's conference room, that you did not angle your best self at the person you most needed to convince. You brought your best self to the entire room and let it be enough or not. At the 90-minute mark, Sonia uncrossed her arms and spoke for the first time. "The image with the woman at the table," she said. "Coffee cup window light, not looking at the camera. Walk me through it." Clara knew exactly which image it was. Third day of the Beaufort shoot, a staff member on her break, completely unposed, sitting in a moment of genuine rest, in the way that people rest when they've forgotten to be conscious of being watched. Clara had been moving through the space tracking light when she'd seen her, and something had fired in her chest that was not thought but pure instinct, and she had stopped and raised the camera and trusted that reaction completely. "I wasn't thinking," Clara said. "I was reacting." She was holding the cup like she was completely at rest and completely alive at the same time, like she was fully inside that moment without any awareness that the moment had value. She held Sonia's gaze. "My job was to capture that without breaking it, to be present enough to see it and invisible enough not to disturb it. And if you'd missed it, I wouldn't have." Sonja looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth exactly, but the specific recognition of one person who takes their work seriously acknowledging another. She looked at Robert and said, "We're done deliberating." Robert looked at Clara. "4 features for our American Independent series," he said. "Women-owned businesses. Charleston, Nashville, Portland, Chicago. 6-month timeline, fall publication. We'll send contract terms this week." He paused. "Do you have questions?" Clara put both hands flat on the table. She had practiced this, not the words, but the willingness to say exactly what she needed without softening it into a question or qualifying it into something she could take back if the room responded badly. "My retainer with Harlow Collection includes hospitality and lifestyle exclusivity," she said. "I need editorial work explicitly carved out before I sign." "That's standard in our agreements," Robert said. "We'll confirm it in writing." "Then yes," she said. "I want to do this." She shook hands around the room. Sonia's handshake was brief and direct and said everything her words hadn't. Clara walked out of the Current building into the New York afternoon and stood on the sidewalk for exactly 30 seconds. She let the city move around her, the taxis, the people, the particular relentless forward energy of a place that did not pause for anyone's private reckoning. Then she started walking. No destination. Just moving the way she'd been moving for 5 months, because motion was the thing that kept the grief from calcifying and the fear from setting in and the forward direction from becoming optional. She called Madeline from the sidewalk. "New York went well?" she said when her sister picked up. "Define well." "National Magazine, 6-month series, 4 features." The silence lasted 4 full seconds. Then Madeline said in a voice doing its absolute best to stay composed, "Clara Whitmore." "Yeah. 4 features." "Yes." "In 5 months." Another pause longer. "In 5 months from the restaurant you have a studio, a 2-year hotel contract, a grant and exhibition that's already been picked up by a Savannah gallery, and now a national magazine series." "When you say it like that, it sounds fast." "It is fast," Madeline said. "It's also exactly right." She paused. "That man did you the greatest accidental favor of his life." Clara looked at the New York skyline above the buildings around her, at the particular gray-blue of the sky over a city that was indifferent to everyone's personal story and somehow generative because of that indifference. "He showed me a door," she said. "I'm the one who walked through it." "You kicked it off its hinges," Madeline said. "Either way," Clara said. "I'm on the other side." She took the evening train home. She sat in her seat and watched the landscape unspool as the light left the sky. The low country marshes, the wide, flat geometry of the South Carolina coast, the particular quality of coming home to a place that was now completely hers to return to, her apartment, her studio, her city, her life. She had spent 4 years in Charleston as a supporting character in someone else's narrative. She was going to spend the rest of it as the author of her own. The Room's exhibition opened on a Friday evening in early March. 5 months and 3 weeks after the anniversary dinner. 5 months and 3 weeks from the worst night of her adult life to a solo exhibition on Upper King Street with press coverage from 2 arts publications and a Savannah gallery already committed to hosting the full collection afterward. Clara arrived 90 minutes early. She walked the sequence alone, all 22 images, the arc she had built over months of work and grief and reconstruction. She had spent 2 full Saturdays hanging the show herself, because she needed to feel the rhythm of it in the room before anyone else did, needed to understand how each image breathed in relation to the ones beside it. She had moved image 7 twice before she was satisfied. She had stood back and looked and known when it was right, and that knowing had felt like one more piece of evidence that the instinct she had suppressed for 4 years was fully back and fully hers. She stopped at image 7 for a long time. The woman at the coffee cup, the window light, the specific quality of being completely inside a moment without performance, without awareness of being seen, without the particular self-consciousness that came from knowing that what you were doing mattered. Just presence, pure and uncurated and real. Dr. Reeves had asked her in their last session before the opening, "How does it feel to show this work publicly after 4 years away?" Clara had sat with the question honestly, the way Dr. Reeves had taught her to sit with things without rushing to the answer that would sound healthy, without reaching for the response that would demonstrate progress, just feeling the actual texture of it. "Like standing in a room where all the walls are down," she said finally. "Nothing to hide behind. Everything that's mine just visible." "Is that terrifying?" "Yes," she said, "but it's the right kind of terrifying, the kind that means you're doing something real." Madeline arrived at the gallery first champagne in hand, having promised to suppress all practicality for the evening, and immediately walking the room with the eye of a woman who had spent her whole life seeing through things to what they actually were. She stopped in front of image 7, then turned and said, "It needs to be 2 inches lower." Clara moved it 2 inches lower without arguing. They stood back together and looked. "Perfect," Madeline said. "You're always right and I hate it." "You love it," Madeline said. "You'd be lost without someone who tells you the truth without dressing it up first." Patricia Okafor arrived with 9 people she'd promised 12 and offered a completely unrepentant shrug about the 3 who hadn't materialized. She walked directly to image 12, stopped, and stood without speaking for nearly a full minute. The image was from the Meridian thread shoot, a seamstress's hands moving over fabric, the particular concentrated grace of a person doing work they had spent years mastering. It was the image Patricia had submitted to the Charleston Arts Foundation without asking. Clara came to stand beside her. "This is where it started," Patricia said quietly. "I know. I want you to know something." Patricia turned to look at her directly. "When I submitted that portfolio, I was certain about 2 things. One, that you were going to be angry with me." "I was going to be angry with you," Clara said. "And 2, that the work was ready whether you knew it or not." Patricia held her gaze. "There's a version of you that would have kept waiting for permission to believe that. I just removed the option." Clara looked at image 12, at the hands she had photographed without fully understanding in that moment what she was capturing, at the truth of someone's work held still and made visible. "Thank you," she said, "for not asking first." Simone Tran arrived in a structured blazer that was clearly intentional, the kind of armor you assembled when you had decided to take something seriously and wanted your presence to communicate that decision before you said a word. She walked the room alone, as was her way, and found Clara near the back wall 20 minutes into the evening. "The Savannah Gallery is confirmed," she said. "Kevin told you. He told me. Full collection. They want it in June." She looked at the images around them. "The Harlow pieces, I've already drafted the loan agreement. No attribution cost." "Simone, your visibility is my visibility," Simone said simply. "That's how this works when it's done right." Clara looked at the woman who had extended a 2-year contract on the basis of a conversation and a 3-hour shoot, who had said, "Don't stop listening to yourself about that particular topic," who had treated her ability as a given and demanded only that she show up and do the work. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said. "Yes." "Did you know it would go like this when you hired me? Did you know?" Simone considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I knew you were extraordinary," she said. "I didn't know how fast you'd remember it." Emily Lawson arrived with her partner and a cluster of clients moving through the gallery with the efficiency of someone running 3 strategic calculations simultaneously and making it look like casual social engagement. She found Clara within 10 minutes and pulled her slightly aside, showing her phone without preamble. "The image 7 shares," she said. Clara looked at the screen. The Harlow image, the woman at the coffee cup, the window light, the full presence quality had been shared across platforms by numbers that made Clara's chest tighten. She scrolled through some of the comments. Women writing about what the image made them feel, about what it meant to be fully inside your own life rather than performing it for someone else's comfort. About the specific grief of realizing at 40 or 50 or 60 that you had been living at partial volume for years, about the decision to turn it up. She stopped scrolling before she started crying in the middle of her own exhibition. "This is what you're doing," Emily said quietly. "This is the actual thing, not just the craft, the thing underneath the craft." Clara handed the phone back. "I didn't know I was doing it until it was done." "That's usually how the most important things work," Emily said. Dr. Reeves arrived quietly alone, the way she did everything without announcement, without the need to be acknowledged. Clara spotted her in front of image 7, standing with the particular stillness of someone who was not looking at a photograph, but thinking through something the photograph had opened up. She didn't approach her immediately. She let her have the image. It seemed right. Grace Holloway found Clara near the end of the first hour. Grace was the woman from Columbia, the textile company owner, the one who had driven in specifically because she'd read about the exhibition and believed before she'd ever seen the work that she needed to meet the person making it. She had walked the room twice before she approached Clara, and when she did, she pressed her business card into Clara's hand and said, "I don't make decisions this quickly as a rule, but I've walked this room twice, and every time I look at your work, I think she sees the truth of things. She doesn't flinch from it, and she doesn't dress it up." She closed Clara's fingers around the card. "Call me Monday. I have a story, and I want you to tell it." Clara looked at the card. A textile company. A woman who had built something real with her hands and wanted the truth of it seen without apology. "I'll call you Monday," she said. It was 40 minutes later, when the gallery had reached the particular density and energy of an evening that had found its own momentum, that she heard the voice behind her that stopped everything. "The seventh image," the voice said. "It's the best one in the room." She turned around. Nathaniel was standing near the entrance. He was not in a suit. He wore the dark jeans and the jacket she recognized from years ago, the one he put on at weekends when he wasn't being the version of himself that the business required. He was holding nothing. His hands hung at his sides with the specific quality of a man who had surrendered the authority he usually carried without quite knowing how to stand in its absence. The room kept moving around them, people talking, glasses clinking, the ordinary social sounds of an evening that didn't know it had just tilted on its axis. Clara looked at him across the room for a long moment. Then she walked toward him slowly, because she was not going to have this conversation at volume. "How did you know about tonight?" she asked when she reached him. "Emily's campaign," he said. "She's very good." "She is." "I know I shouldn't be here." He said it plainly without working to make it sympathetic. "I'm not going to pretend I had standing to come, but I needed to see it. What you built." He looked at the images on the walls, at the people moving through them, at the full visible fact of a life being constructed in real time. "I've been reading about it for 2 months, hearing about it from mutual people, looking at the images online, and I kept thinking I need to see it with my own eyes, because part of me keeps looking for the thing I'm missing, the part that explains how someone goes through what you went through and produces this on the other side of it." "There's nothing to explain," she said. "You left a space, I filled it." He was quiet. He looked at image 7 across the room. "I drove past Cypress Street last week," he said. "The new people have a dog. There's a yellow bicycle on the porch." A pause. "It doesn't look like ours anymore." "It's not ours anymore," she said. "It's theirs." "I know." He looked back at her. "Victoria called me 2 weeks ago. She's getting married. Someone she met in Atlanta." He said it without self-pity. Just information. She sounded happy. She sounded like a version of herself I don't think I ever actually knew. Clara waited. "I think I was in love with an idea of her," he said. "The same way—" He stopped. Started again. "I think I was in love with the idea of what our life looked like from the outside. The house, the business, the successful couple. I don't know if I was ever fully present inside any of it." "You weren't," Clara said simply. Not as cruelty, as fact. He absorbed it without flinching. "No," he said. "I wasn't." "That's your work," she said. "Not mine. I can't tell you how to figure out how to be present. I had to figure that out myself in the worst possible circumstances." She held his gaze steadily. "But I did figure it out. And you will too if you decide to. That's the only advice I have." He nodded slowly. Not the nod of a man agreeing strategically. The nod of a man who had run out of arguments and was standing in the open space that left behind. "The photography," he said. "Patricia told me you're shooting a national series, that a magazine in New York, Current," she said, "that Current commissioned you." He looked at her. "I remember when you sold the camera equipment for the Hargrove deposit. You said it was fine." "It wasn't fine," she said. "I know that now." "You knew it then," she said. "You just let me say it was fine because that was easier than acknowledging what it actually was." I didn't defend himself. That surprised her. The old Nathaniel would have found an angle, a reframe, a way to distribute the responsibility more evenly. This version just stood with it. "You're right," he said. "I know I'm right," she said. Not unkindly, just steadily. He looked at image 7 one last time. The woman at the coffee cup, the window light, the full presence quality that had been shared thousands of times by women who recognized something in it that they hadn't had language for before. "You always had this," he said. "The ability to see the thing inside the thing. I thought it was just how you talked about your work. I didn't understand it was actually how you saw the world." "It's how I've always seen the world," she said. "You just never looked closely enough at me to notice." That landed. She watched it land. She watched him absorb it without trying to soften it or redirect it, and she respected that. Whatever else Nathaniel Carter had failed at, he was at least in this conversation in this gallery on this March evening being honest. "Take care of yourself," he said finally. "I do," she said. "I always have. You just weren't watching." He nodded. He walked toward the door. She watched him go, and she waited the way she always waited, braced for the grief to arrive, for the particular ambush of it that had been finding her in unguarded moments for 5 months. It didn't come. What arrived instead was something she recognized from the parking lot of the restaurant from the night she had driven away in the blue dress with her hands steady on the wheel. The feeling of a door closing, not slamming, not breaking, just closing, fully, with the clean final sound of something completed. She stood in that feeling for a moment, then she turned back to her room. Madeline was at her elbow in 10 seconds. She handed Clara the champagne glass. She said nothing for a moment. They stood together looking at the room, at the people, at the images, at the whole living fact of the evening. "He came," Madeline said quietly. "He came. And now he's gone," Clara said. "That's the whole story." Madeline looked at her with the expression that had no name because it was too specific to their particular history. The look that said, "I have known you since before you knew yourself, and I can see exactly how far you have traveled." "You know what I see right now?" Madeline said. "Tell me." "Image 7, Madeline said. "That quality you kept describing to me, the being fully inside it quality." She touched Clara's arm once briefly, in the way she touched things she cared about carefully and without ceremony. "You got there. You're there right now." Clara looked at the room, at Patricia and Simone and Emily and Dr. Reeves, who was still standing in front of Image 7 with the focused stillness of someone who had been waiting to see this outcome for months and was allowing herself to register it fully. At Grace Holloway from Columbia, who was talking to one of Emily's clients with the animation of a woman who had found her people for the evening. At Kevin Marsh, who caught Clara's eye across the room and raised his glass slightly. At the 22 images breathing on the walls. At the particular quality of the light in the gallery at this hour, which was doing something she hadn't anticipated and couldn't have planned, something that made the images look like they were generating their own warmth rather than borrowing it from the fixtures above them. She had not planned that, but she recognized it. She had spent years learning how to recognize it. The evening moved through its natural art conversations, deepening glasses being refilled, the Savannah Gallery contact, introducing himself formally, and talking for 20 minutes about the June timeline and what he wanted to do with the collection. Kevin confirmed that both press pieces were running with full image spreads. Emily showed her final engagement numbers that she described as the best performing campaign she had ever run, which she said with the tone of someone who did not exaggerate benchmarks for the sake of making a client feel good. At 9:30 a woman approached Clara, who she didn't recognize, mid-50s, with the direct, unhurried manner of someone who had been deciding whether to speak for a while and had finally committed. "My name is Helen Park," the woman said. "I own a restaurant group, 4 locations in Charleston and 1 opening in Savannah next year. I've been looking for a photographer who understands what a place feels like from the inside, not just what it looks like from across the room." She paused. "I found her tonight." Clara looked at her. "Tell me about the Savannah location." They talked for 15 minutes. Helen Park had the specific clarity of a business owner who knew exactly what she wanted and had enough experience to know what it looked like when she was in the presence of someone who could deliver it. By the end of the conversation, they had a meeting scheduled for the following Thursday. Clara walked away from that conversation and stood near the back of the gallery for a moment alone. She counted the current series, the Harlow Retainer, the Grace Holloway meeting Monday, the Helen Park meeting Thursday, the Savannah exhibition in June. A business that was by every measurable indicator operating at a level she had not allowed herself to plan for when she had signed the studio lease 7 months ago. 7 months. She thought about the legal pad she had filled at Madeline's kitchen table the morning after the anniversary dinner. She thought about the emails she had sent with her maiden name before she'd consciously decided to use it. She thought about Daniel Prescott's conference room and Ruth Calder's forensic accounting and the specific feeling of sitting across from Nathaniel and Gregory Hale with her hands flat on the table and knowing exactly what she wanted without apology. She thought about the east-facing window of her studio and the morning light doing exactly what she had known it would do. She thought about Image 7. She thought about what it meant to be fully inside a moment without knowing the moment was worth capturing. She thought, I know now. I know it's worth capturing. Every single one. The last guests left at 10:20. Kevin Marsh walked the room with her one final time, confirming everything was secure. And then he shook her hand and said, "This is the beginning of something significant. I want you to know that's not something I say as a matter of course." "I know," she said. "Thank you for seeing it before I did." "Patricia saw it first," he said. "Patricia always does." She helped with the final check of the room, turned off the back hallway light, and walked out onto King Street into the March night. Cool, clear, the kind of air that felt like an invitation, rather than just weather. Simone was on the sidewalk. She fell into step beside Clara without preamble. It was the only way Simone operated without preamble, without the social lubrication of setup. "The Nashville shoot," Simone said. "4 days in April," Clara said. "I'm thinking arrive Sunday shoot, Monday through Wednesday, travel day Thursday. I need you for Harlow the following week. Spring content, 2 days minimum." "Already blocked," Clara said. "I put it in before I booked the Nashville travel." Simone glanced at her sideways with an expression that was as close to impressed as Simone Tron ever got. "You're going to be busy." "Yes." "Is that what you want?" The question landed the way Simone's questions always landed, directly without padding, expecting a direct answer. Clara thought about the woman who had worn a blue dress to a restaurant and waited to be chosen. She thought about sitting in the driver's seat in the parking lot afterward, hands on the wheel, the night ahead of her, every decision that followed being entirely hers. She thought about the particular silence of her studio in the early morning before the city woke up, when it was just her and the east-facing light, and the work she had chosen to do with her own hands in her own name. "More than I've ever wanted anything," she said, and meant it completely. They parted at the corner. Clara walked to her car alone. She drove home to her apartment, third-floor, east-facing window, the lease signed in her own name, the walls hung with her own work, because she had learned that you put your work where you could see it, not hidden in an office or stored in a folder, but out visible, taking up space the way you took up space when you understood that you had a right to it. She made tea. She sat at her work table. She opened the Nashville research file and began reading about the woman she was going to photograph, a ceramicist named Jo. 11 years building a studio in a neighborhood, the world had not taken seriously who made things with her hands, that told the truth of what it meant to make things with your hands. Who had started over after her own kind of disruption. Who had decided at a moment when the practical choice would have been to stop, that stopping was not actually an option. Clara read the profile twice. She made notes in the margins. She thought about what light would do in a ceramic studio in the morning versus the afternoon, what the work itself would look like through a lens that was trying to honor it rather than flatter it. She thought, "I'm going to take extraordinary care of this story." She closed the laptop at 11:50. She was tired in the right way, not depleted, not drained, but the productive exhaustion of a person who had spent the day doing things that mattered, every single one of them. She washed her face, went through the ordinary rituals of her life, and got into bed and lay in the dark, looking at the ceiling. She thought about the anniversary dinner, about Nathaniel's face in the candlelight when he said the words, about the gift box hitting the floor and his eyes not dropping to find it, about driving away with the night ahead of her and understanding somewhere in the animal intelligent part of herself that preceded conscious thought that the only person who got to decide what happened next was her. She thought about what she had decided. She thought about what 5 months of deciding looked like when you laid it all out: the studio, the contracts, the grant, the exhibition, the New York meeting, the series, the Savannah Gallery, the Monday call with Grace, the Thursday meeting with Helen Park, the April shoot in Nashville, the whole impossible accumulation of a life being reclaimed and expanded and made more fully hers than it had ever been. She thought about Image 7. She thought, "That's me. That's who I am now. Fully inside the moment, not performing it, not surviving it, not waiting for someone to give me permission to be in it. Just here, completely here." She turned off the light. She slept immediately, the deep, untroubled sleep that had been hers every night since the morning after the anniversary dinner. The sleep of a woman who had stopped bracing for something to be taken from her, because everything worth keeping she had built with her own hands, and it was hers completely and irrevocably, and no one in the world had the standing to wish it away. Clara Whitmore had been told in a candlelit restaurant by a man who did not look up when her gift hit the floor that she was not worth choosing. She had taken that verdict and refused it. She had taken the wreckage of a 5-year marriage and turned it into a studio, a grant, 2 major contracts, a national magazine commission, a solo exhibition, and a second venue already lined up before the first one had even closed. She had done it in 5 months. She had done it with her own hands, her own name, her own eye, her own uncompromising and finally unapologetic understanding of what she was worth. Nathaniel Carter had made a wish on their anniversary. Clara Whitmore had made a life. And that life, expanding, luminous, entirely and completely hers, was the only answer she had ever needed to give him.